We say things like, maybe later, perhaps another time, or I'll see you tomorrow. But for some of us, there won't be a tomorrow. Listen as your worst nightmares come to life. These nightmares have become someone's reality. My name is Justin Crowley, and this is The Murder Project. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 21 of The Murder Project. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about a case that came from a listener. This will be another listener case that we're going to be doing. This listener is out of the Michigan area, and her name is April. And she reached out to The Murder Project and asked if we could cover this one. And after I looked into it, I realized it is a very, very good case for what we do here at The Murder Project. So I was more than happy to do this one. In this episode, we're going to be talking about a case that I think is pretty controversial, and which side of the fence you end up on, I think could be anybody's guess. I know where I kind of stand, but of course we'll wait for that to be discussed later. This is the story about Nicole, or Nikki as she was referred to, Addimando, and the death of her common law husband or boyfriend, whichever you look at it, Chris Grover. What we're going to be looking at in this case is, was this murder or was this self-defense, and how does that kind of play out in the court system? Strap in, ladies and gentlemen. Episode 21 starts right now. I think a good place to start in this story about Nikki and her boyfriend Chris would be at the beginning. Now, the events that took place on the night where Chris lost his life was in September of 2017, and I think we need to understand what the full story is before we get to the actual incident that took place, because there's a lot of things that happened on the night that is in question. But really, the build up to this is kind of where I think a lot of us are going to make our decisions on what we feel like this case should be. Should it be a homicide? Is it murder? Or is this self-defense? And it's very tricky to see what side it should be, or, you know, whatever your personal beliefs are as to how you formulate your opinion. But I think that we're going to have some people that are on one side, and definitely some people that are on the other. So this story is primarily about Nikki Addimando and her common law husband or boyfriend, Christopher Grover, and they met each other in 2010. They lived up in Poughkeepsie, New York, and Chris was 21 years old and Nikki was 19 years old whenever they met. They both worked at a gymnastics facility, and they were coaches. Now, like so many coworkers start out, or so many that fall in love, Nikki and Chris were friends while they were working at this gymnastics facility. And as time went on, and as they spent more time with each other, they realized that they had more than just a friendship, and they started a dating relationship. Now, at this time, Nikki was living at home with her mother, and Chris had his own apartment. And after they started dating, they decided that Nikki was going to leave the gymnastics facility. And I don't know if this is because that there was some sort of conflict of interest in Chris and Nikki working there together, or if she just decided that it would be better if she worked at a different place. When Nikki left her job coaching gymnastics, she moved over into kind of a similar field, I guess you could say, working with younger children in a daycare type facility, nursery. And not long after this, Nikki and Chris were expecting their first child. And after Nikki found out that she was pregnant and she was going to be having Chris's child, they decided that Nikki could stay home and be a stay-at-home mother for the child. And I'm not sure how long after she started at this daycare that she decided to stay home with her child, or if it was right after the child was born, as in she worked up to the point where she was about to have the child and then she left. But either way, it is safe to say that while they were both coaching gymnastics and then started dating each other. There had been about 2 years' time that had spanned between meeting each other and the courtship, and then the pregnancy and Nikki deciding to stay home. So we're in 2013 now, and what happens is Nikki has the baby, and she is at home with the baby, and about 6 weeks after their first child is born, this is when Nikki starts talking about abuse for the first time. And I think this could be one of those things I was thinking about. Was it seemed like the relationship was going really well. They're 2 years into dating and knowing each other, and it's one of those situations where I feel like for the first time, Chris is now in some sort of a competition. But the weird thing is that the competition is his own child, and I don't know if that got him to a point where he didn't feel like he was being appreciated enough, or there was enough attention being shown to him, and this might have changed the way that he acted towards Nikki and the way that he was definitely treating her. After the child was born, like I said, this is about 6 weeks later, and Chris starts complaining that even though she had just had a child 6 weeks before, he still has quote-unquote needs. And I think we all know what direction this might be headed in. So 6 weeks after the child is born, this is when Nikki states that Chris assaulted her for the first time and forced himself on her. And what I mean by that is that he raped her against her will. Nikki did not report any of this to authorities or to any sort of hospital or organization that deals with things like this. Instead, she probably treated it as if it was a one-time incident and that something like this would probably not happen. I don't think Nikki was probably delusional at this point, because up until now she had never been assaulted by Chris and he had never done anything like this. So she kind of kept this incident to herself, and I'm sure she was hoping that something like this wouldn't happen. But there's some information that we have that says that the abuse continued, and there's some information that kind of jumps to 2014, the next year. And in 2014, Nikki becomes pregnant with her second child. Her and Chris are going to be parents again, and it is said that during this time, similar issues arose, whereas Chris bit her on the shoulder. He slammed her face into a countertop 2 times, and once again, he sexually assaulted her. Now, after this incident happened, Nikki decided that she was going to call Family Support Services, and she said that when she called Family Support Services, they told her that she needed to file a police report in order to document this incident. Now, Nikki did not file a police report, and she did not get any emergency protective orders set up so that Chris could not be around her or her children. And from what I understand, she did not do this because she was afraid of some sort of retaliation by Chris, or that he was going to spin some sort of narrative that caused Nikki to lose custody of her kids. The one thing that she did do after this that would kind of go in her favor, luckily, is that she went to the hospital and she had an exam done, and all of this incident was documented. And by that, I mean they were able to document the bite marks on her as well as the bruising on her face from where she said she was slammed into the counter. And then also there was a sexual assault exam done while she was at the hospital. A few weeks after this whole incident was documented, Nikki found herself again back at the hospital, and she was back for another exam. One of the things that was documented in this exam is that Nikki appeared to be very nervous. She was whispering, she had poor eye contact, and she was shaking. Now, this time when she went back to the hospital, I don't know if things were worse would be the right way to describe this, but in this incident, Nikki showed up to the hospital and she had bite marks on her body and also burns to her body. She was burned on her breast, on her thighs, and also on her genitals. And what Nikki told the examiners at the hospital was that the burns on her body came from a spoon. And what she said was that Chris would heat up a spoon and burn her on her body. Now, I think it's important to point out that all of this is happening while Nikki is pregnant. She's pregnant with their second child, and the escalation that Chris is kind of bringing forth is a whole lot worse than I'm sure Nikki thought that things were going to go. Now, after the first child was born is when the abuse started, but it's really escalating at a rate right now where I think anybody could feel like this is very dangerous territory for Nikki. She did make a police report after this incident with the bite marks and the burns to her body, and it was a situation where I'm sure that the police were asking her if they wanted her to look into it, but she refused to cooperate with the police. And I know that there is a lot of opinions about things like this, but it's also very common that when women get put into a situation where they're being assaulted by their significant other, a lot of times they don't want to report these incidences because they're afraid of further abuse and several other factors that go into this. Things that I definitely want to talk about in more detail, but I'll probably save most of those things for the debrief. Now, in February of 2015, going a little bit forward, their second child was born, and the abuse continued after the birth of this child. Later on in court documents, it would come out that Nikki said that after this time, Chris would videotape himself sexually assaulting Nikki, and then he would post these videos to Pornhub without her permission. And I also think it is worth mentioning that during the trial of all of this, those accusations were actually made true, and that the detectives that were investigating the cases found the videos on Pornhub or on the internet porn site, whichever one it was, and were able to confirm this part of her story. Now, she went back after more abuse to Family Support Services, and at this time Nikki was given a risk assessment, and she was told that she was in a high risk category bracket because of the abuse that she had been enduring of being killed by Chris. Like, she was in a risk category where the representatives at this Family Support Services were saying, like, you need to be careful because Chris has access to a gun. He had a gun that was registered to him. Chris had been sexually assaulting Nikki, and Chris had also strangled Nikki. All of these factors put together were kind of calculated, and they were telling Nikki, like, you have to be careful because there's a chance that you may not walk away from this relationship. You may be put into a situation where Chris decides one night in the continued escalation that he's going to kill you. So later this year, in November of 2015, Family Support Services contacted the police. And I don't know if there was a undocumented incident where Nikki went back, but Family Support Services decided that they wanted to reach out to the police and make a formal report on their behalf. I think it's taken a while for this to come about, but I don't know what the circumstances were involving all of the matters as to why it took so long, and cooperation could have been a thing that held this process up, and they may have decided several years in, after she had already suffered so much abuse, that they were just going to kind of go around her and make a outcry to say for her. Now, detectives were put on this case, and like I mentioned earlier, they did find the evidence of Nikki's sex videos being posted to Pornhub, and they also found that her accusations of abuse was credible because there were pictures taken a lot of times when she would contact Family Support Services, and the detectives that were assigned this case actually drew up paperwork to get formal charges brought against Chris. But the one thing that they needed from Nikki is they had to get her to fill out a affidavit, basically saying that all of the things that she told Family Support Services, all of the pictures, all of the evidence was in fact true and correct. But Nikki refused to sign a witness affidavit, and basically the case hit a dead end. They did not file any charges against Chris, and they decided that without Nikki's cooperation, they were not going to be able to pursue charges against Chris. And this is another thing, like I mentioned earlier, it's very common to not have witness cooperation, and there is a laundry list of reasons why that could be the case. It's also, I think it's important to mention that we don't victim blame people that get into situations like this because they feel like they are trapped in a situation that they can't get out of. And that is something that if you haven't been in a similar situation, you do not know and you can't comprehend. And so I think it would be a disservice to survivors out there if we started Monday morning quarterbacking their decisions why or why not they did or did not cooperate with the police. Now, as we get into 2016, the abuse continued, but there was no further action in way of family support services or the police. So this is kind of one of those years where I'm sure that the abuse continued just like it had before, but there were no documented incidences that I am aware of. Let's fast forward into 2017. Now, September 26th, to be exact, 2017, Nikki and Chris got a call from Family Support Services, and they said that an anonymous person called in and asked them to check in on the family. This person stated that they went to the facility that Chris worked at because at this time, he is still a gymnastics coach at the same place he was working when he met Nikki. And this person observed Chris losing his temper and yelling at kids there, as well as noticing that every time Nikki showed up to the gymnastics facility, she had visible bruising on her body. I think there's probably at least enough speculation for me that I can get into that there's probably a little bit of buzz around the place that Chris worked at, and that if people saw bruising on Nikki, they probably started to talk and wonder about what was going on. And finally, someone had the courage to reach out and say, hey, this needs to be checked on. And so they contacted Family Support Services and said, hey, would you look into this? Now, obviously, we already know that Family Support Services is familiar with Nikki and Chris's situation. So they did not hesitate, and they called them to set up a meeting. That meeting took place the very next day on September 27th, 2017. CPS this time, Child Protective Services, came over to the house because I'm sure with Family Support Services and Child Protective Services, I don't know if in New York they operated under the same umbrella or if they were two separate entities. But in this case, CPS came over to do a welfare check on the children. And they interviewed Chris and Nikki separately, which is common practice. And as a police officer, I can tell you that when we went over to interview people in situations of family violence, it is always, or at least the department I worked at, it was mandatory that two deputies went to the call. And normally what we do is one person would take one of the parties involved and the other deputy would take the other party involved, and we would get their stories, and basically we would meet back up and see if these stories matched or what the discrepancies were. Or in some situations, we would actually switch. Like, say, if I was speaking to a female that was a victim of assault family violence and my partner was speaking to the male, we would come back and talk to each other, and then we might switch, and I would go talk to the male, and then the other responding deputy would go talk to the female, and then we would see if we could either match the stories up or kind of remove any discrepancies that we felt were there. So while Child Protective Services are over there interviewing Nikki and Chris, they stick to a story where, from what I understand, Nikki and Chris both deny that there is any sort of abuse going on. And I'm not exactly sure how the whole investigation shakes out, because what we're going to find out soon is there's not going to be really enough time to do a formal investigation. But what I do know is that after the visit from CPS, it was said that Chris and Nikki both called friends and family that they were close to and told them that if CPS reaches out to any of the friends or family to deny any accusation that there was abuse in the home. And I know that we can look at this from a viewpoint that why would Nikki cooperate with all of this? And I think the easiest answer would be that if this scenario is true and correct, Chris probably told Nikki that she was going to do this, or there would be some sort of violence that occurred if she did not. And I think it's also important to point out that Nikki and Chris both knew that there were previous filings of abuse, and that Nikki was probably afraid that because this violence continued in the household and she was still present in the household, that there was a chance that CPS can or would take away her children. And I don't know how familiar listeners are with the process of CPS, but basically, if they feel like that the children in this household are in any sort of danger, they can file paperwork to have the children removed from the household, or they can remove them in a emergency order if they feel like the children are in imminent danger. And this could be a process that takes time, or this could literally be CPS showing up to your house and removing your kids right then. So I'm sure Nikki was scared that something like this could happen, and I'm sure that Chris was worried that this could also reflect negatively on him. So the very next day, this is when the incident kind of comes to a head. And I'm sure that after CPS left, there was probably a lot going on inside that household that we just won't know about, and we will probably never know about. If Chris was the man that Nikki claimed him to be, I'm sure this was a very stressful time for her, and I'm sure that there were a lot of things or actions said or done in that household that we just aren't privy to, and that we may not ever know about. Like I mentioned, just hours after they left. So this is the next day, but literally, I'm meaning the same day that CPS showed up, into the morning hours, when it would have went from, midnight, September 27th to September 28th. Nikki would end up shooting Chris in the head and killing him. From what I understand, Nikki said is that her kids were asleep in the house or the apartment that they lived in. And her story is that they had consensual sex and that they had fallen asleep in each other's arms on their couch in the living room. Nikki stated that she woke up, and when she tried to get off the couch, Chris woke up. And when Chris woke up, he pulled a gun out from the cushions of the couch, which I find a little bit strange, but we will continue. Apparently, a struggle ensued kind of over the gun, and Nikki stated that she kneed him and then hit his arm. When Nikki hit Chris's arm, he dropped the gun, and Nikki was able to get control of the gun that he had. What Nikki said is that when she picked up the gun, Chris laughed at her and said basically that she wouldn't pull the trigger, that she didn't have the guts to do it, and that she wouldn't be able to do what needed to be done, per se. Now, I'm paraphrasing this, of course, but Nikki said after this, Chris told her that once he gained control of the weapon, he was going to kill Nikki and then kill himself. And in a situation like this, if this is playing out the way that Nikki said it did, she has to feel like there's a chance that Chris would not only kill her and himself, but also possibly the kids. But Nikki says that after Chris said that he was going to kill her and then kill himself, she lunged at Chris and pulled the trigger. And Chris was shot right in the middle of his forehead. Just after this, it is about 2 a.m. in the morning, and a police cruiser pulls up on a vehicle that is stopped at a traffic light. The difference is with this traffic light is that it was green and Nikki was not moving. So the police officer honked his horn, and Nikki exited the vehicle, left her kids in the car, and walked up to the police officer and said that she had killed Chris and that the gun, quote, went off. Later, when the police arrived to the apartment, they found Chris in the apartment, and he was dead with one shot to his head. And the weird thing about the way they found Chris is that he was laying on the couch, and he had one hand to his side, one hand across his chest, and his eyes were open. So we'll get into this a little more here in just a second, but I think that's not going to be good for Nikki whenever she has to go to trial. So eventually Nikki was arrested for the death of Chris, and she was booked into jail on second-degree murder, first and second-degree manslaughter, and first-degree criminal possession of a firearm. And I believe the reason that they did the second-degree murder was because they did not feel that Nikki planned the death of Chris, that in one way or the other, the events that led up to this were sort of spontaneous and not calculated or planned. And then the first and second-degree manslaughter, I think, were probably charges that were put in there in case the second-degree murder didn't stick. And the first-degree criminal possession of a firearm was because the laws in New York are a little different than the laws here, but Chris legally owned the firearm that was used to kill him, but Nikki did not legally own that firearm, and the firearm was used in a crime, so she was able to be charged with this per their laws. There was a bond that Nikki was given, and she was able to obtain bond, and she was released from custody with a GPS tracking device. The trial did not start until March of 2019, and I think we know that both sides of this are going to say exactly the opposite. Nikki's defense is that she is a battered woman who has been subjected to countless abuse and sexual assault, and the DA's office is going to say that none of this was true and that Chris was a good guy and Nikki just killed him. And of course, that's what happens. Now, there's a lot of things that are going to happen in the trial that I really think we need to kind of dissect and go into in the debrief, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time there, but I do want to kind of go into a little bit more. As I mentioned before, Nikki stated that throughout their relationship, she had experienced abuse, and the DA's office said that it was unfounded, and the DA's office also stated that Nikki had bad patterns of behaviors. The DA's office also wanted to point out that the gun was pressed against Chris's head and that there was a hard contact wound on his head, which means that there were probably burn patterns from the pistol against his forehead from when the weapon was fired. And Nikki's defense was basically a affirmative defense. She was saying, as I mentioned earlier, that she had been suffering from battered women syndrome and that she kind of had a learned helplessness in her relationship with Chris, and that she was unable to remove herself from this relationship, and therefore she continued to become a victim of Chris's abusive behaviors. One of the things that the DA's office also pointed out was that Nikki had sent a text message to one of her friends after her friend asked if she had left Chris yet. And Nikki responded to this message saying that no, she hadn't, and she hadn't figured out a way to kill him yet, with a grimace emoji. Later on, Nikki would say that she sent that grimace emoji whenever she was playing, and if I'm not mistaken, that's the emoji with the kind of squiggly mouth. And either way, she was saying that that was just a joke, and the DA's office was saying that that was her intent to later commit this crime, but that she was at least had been thinking about it for a while. And if all of the things that Nikki said were true, I don't know anybody that might not be thinking that. But either way, after the trial had concluded, the jury took 3 days to deliberate Nikki's fate, and Nikki was later convicted of the second-degree murder charge, and also the criminal possession of the firearm. The reason that I think that Nikki didn't get anything on the manslaughter charges is because that's why I believe the DA's office included it, is because it was a lesser included charge. And since they got her on the second-degree murder, there was no reason to go after the manslaughter charges. Now, a few weeks after Nikki was found guilty, there was New York passed a Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. And what this states is that if a person is convicted of a crime that was committed in protection of themselves, as if they were saying that they were part of domestic violence, then the judge could come back and offer an alternate sentence that might be less than what is mandated to the current charge. So this act was signed into law by Governor Cuomo, which is kind of funny now that you think about that with all the accusations against him. But Nikki would be able to apply for this because she had yet to be sentenced for the murder charge against Chris. Now, fast forward to February 5th of 2020, when Nikki is sentenced in court. The judge has basically 3 things to judge this Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act off of. And those 3 things are: 1, the defendant must have been a victim of domestic violence at the time of the attack. 2, domestic violence must have been a significant contributing factor to the defendant's participation in the offense. And 3, the defendant's sentence under current law would be unduly harsh. After the judge factored in these 3 kind of prerequisites to this Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, he denied Nikki's claim and said that she did not fall under this new law, which surprised a lot of people because Nikki had a lot of support from her community, and the people that basically helped get this Survivors Act law set up said that she was essentially the perfect candidate for this. Now, Nikki's crime carried 19 years to life or 20 years to life. Everything that I've read on this so far says 19 years to life, which seems like an odd number. But if she would have been included in this Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, she could have been sentenced anywhere to 5 to 15 years instead of the 19 years to life. But as I mentioned, the judge denied her claim and she was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. This is where I think that there is a lot of questions about what is true, what may not be true, what situations could be, or that overall, where do we fall in situations like this? I think that there is a lot of talk when cases like this come up because everybody's obvious answer is they always go to is that the person should have ran and should have gone to the cops. They could have been in a position where they could have left. And I think the judge stated that one of the reasons that Nikki didn't fall under this Survivor Act is because she had the opportunity to get up and walk out the door. And many people may say, yes, she did have the opportunity to leave. But many people may also say, hey, and this is where I kind of fall into the spectrum is, hey, you don't know the circumstances that are going on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week inside this home. And people can be very manipulating, and that goes to both sides. That could be the supposed victim or that could be the supposed aggressor. And I think you really have to break this down piece by piece and kind of look at it. And that's really what I want to do. And I want to give a shout out again to April in Michigan for bringing this case to us, because I truly believe that this is why we set up things like the debrief, so that Mike and I can kind of pick this thing apart. And we want to talk about everything from Chris's side all the way to Nikki's side and everything in between. And I want to go ahead and say up front, don't get angry if you listen to the debrief if Mike or I take Chris's side on certain things and Nikki's on other. All we're doing in those circumstances is actually trying to play the devil's advocate to see where this case might have gone and how it goes. And then ultimately, at the end of this one, I'm also going to give you my take on what I think happened. I'm sure Mike will give you his as well, and what I think the conclusion of this case should have been, or what it could still be. So I think I'm going to leave it there for this one. I am so excited to talk to you guys again on the debrief, because I think we can really get a lot accomplished on this. And I also thought about reaching out to one of my friends. I haven't talked to her yet, but she spent a lot of time in crimes against persons and also human trafficking, and I think she would be a great person to talk to in scenarios like this. So I'm going to reach out to her and see if the next time she comes through town, if she wouldn't mind sitting down with me and discussing some of these things, because I think there is a lot we can learn from situations like this. And also, I want to bring her on so that she can talk about situations that happen and also help either women who have survived incidences like this or women who could be in contact with situations like this in the future. I think that should be good. And if I can get her on, then it'll be later on in an episode, but we will definitely bring that to you. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for this episode of The Murder Project. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will see you next time. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening to this episode of The Murder Project. We're excited to be bringing you this podcast. We noticed that the numbers are going up, the downloads are going up, and that is fantastic. Make sure and tell your friends, tell your family, tell anybody that you think might want to listen to a true crime podcast, and we would really appreciate that. If you guys are looking for us on any of the social media platforms, you can find us on Facebook at The Murder Project. If you need to search for us, you can type in facebook.com/podcasttmp. If you're looking for us on the Instagrams, we are at The Murder Project. And if you want to find us on the Twitter machine, we are at The Murder Pod. Also, we want to remind you guys, if you're listening on Apple, to please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, leave a review, and also hit that 5 stars. If you're listening on any other platforms, hit that subscribe button or hit that like button. It really helps us get past the algorithms, and that puts us in a situation where we can grow this podcast organically, and we don't have to count on a lot of meaningless advertisement. I'll be back with you guys again on the next episode in the debrief. I can't wait to talk to you guys again. I will see you soon, but before I go, please remember, head up, eyes up, and stay alive.